Just got out of bed and saw Mrs. Smith's taking pictures of a bowl of porridge. She saw me coming down and cheerfully said, "Come take a look. Your sister got up early to make us some porridge. This is the first time I've had porridge cooked by one of my own children." Mr. Smith nodded along and said, "Yeah, it tastes pretty good." Home for just 2 weeks, the real daughter, Clara, gave me a smile. "No way," she said. "Has my sister never cooked porridge for Mom and Dad?" I thought that was the basic thing any kid would do for their parents. Maybe she knew all along she wasn't their real daughter and couldn't be bothered to take care of them? I've been hearing a lot of these sarcastic comments these past 2 weeks, so they don't really get to me anymore. I just shook my head and said, "I think things like this are what the housekeeper's for." The bragging from Mr. and Mrs. Smith stopped abruptly, and Clara's smile cracked. The three of them just awkwardly sipped their porridge. Just moments later, Mrs. Smith put down her spoon. "Is there peanut in this porridge?" she asked. "Why am I so itchy?" I looked at her and saw she was breaking out in hives. Our housekeeper, Becky, rushed to get her some allergy medicine. I felt relieved once I saw Mrs. Smith's take the medicine. I frowned at Clara and said, "Why do you make Mom peanut porridge?" I didn't get to finish my sentence before Clara dropped to her knees in front of Mrs. Smith's. "Mom, I just got back home. How was I supposed to know you're allergic to peanuts?" "I made peanut porridge because my sister told me you liked peanuts in your porridge, since you have anemia." Mrs. Smith's was too uncomfortable to speak, and Mr. Smith's was upset. "Sonny," he said, "I know you feel threatened with Clara back, but I promised to treat you both equally. Why frame her like this?" Their accusatory looks did sting a bit, but my upbringing taught me to stay calm in situations like these. I quickly explained, "I didn't say that. A few days ago, Clara asked me what you liked to eat. I casually mentioned a few things, and specifically reminded her about your peanut allergy. You've taken care of me for 25 years. Do you really think I'd make up lies just to make Mom suffer?" Hearing this, Mr. and Mrs. Smith seemed to relax a bit, realizing that I wouldn't do such a thing. Clara, sensing the shift, quickly jumped back in. "Mom and Dad, I swear that's what my sister said. She even mentioned that Mom doesn't like peanut skins, insisting they be thoroughly cleaned before soaking for hours to make them soft. How would I know all that if not from my sister?" Mr. and Mrs. Smith exchanged glances. Mrs. Smith cleared her throat and said, "It's just a little thing. Let's move on. I'm fine now. We just won't eat peanuts next time." I knew Mr. and Mrs. Smiths were favoring Clara. I've never been good at cooking, and had no clue about peanut details like purple skin or soaking. Clara made up all these details to make her story believable, stuff I could never have come up with. But Clara mistakenly thought her lie was foolproof. She probably thought Mr. and Mrs. Smiths weren't believing her because of their bond with me. So she pulled on my pant leg, crying, "Sister, I know you think I'll take your place in their hearts, but I just want to be with Mom and Dad. I promise I won't affect your standing. Please tell the truth. Don't frame me." I waved my phone. "There are security cameras everywhere in the house. I can find footage of you asking me about Mom and Dad's preferences, and of me warning you about the peanuts. So are you going to confess, or should I find it myself?" Clara seemed to panic at my words. After thinking for a moment, she knelt down in front of Mr. and Mrs. Smith's. "Mom, Dad, it's all my fault. I trust my sister. Maybe I misheard. I did suffer hearing issues due to a fever when I was little. I didn't mean to. Mr. and Mrs. Smiths have always been strict about honesty, so I thought they'd scold Clara. But instead Mr. Smiths gently helped her up, saying, "You poor child. You've been through so much." Mrs. Smiths wiped away tears. "It was my fault for not paying attention back then, which led to the mix-up. It's all on me." The three of them cried together, and seemed to forget I was there. Mrs. Smith looked at me with irritation. "Go to your room," she said. "With all those thoughts, you probably can't eat anyway." Becky gave me a sympathetic look, and led me back to my room. As I laid there, I couldn't help but think about how, before Clara came back, Mr. and Mrs. Smith treated me like I was irreplaceable. It's only been 2 weeks, and everything's changed. I just don't get it. Is making up for lost time with Clara really an excuse to neglect me? I just got upstairs when I heard Mr. and Mrs. Smiths choking up while talking to Clara. They said, "Clara, We're not going to the office today. We're going to take you shopping. Whatever you want, we'll buy it. As long as you're happy, that's all that matters to us. Clara tried to politely refuse, but then gave me a sly grin. She turned back to them and said, "Let's bring my sister along. Everything that happened today was my fault, not hers. It's because I didn't listen properly." Mr. and Mrs. Smiths pretended not to hear her, and just left with Clara. Watching them drive off, I really wanted to rush out and tell them that I'm staying at home not for the Smiths' inheritance, but because of how kind they were to me in the past. That's why I've stayed. Besides, my own assets are worth much more than what the Smiths have. I've stepped in and helped them numerous times during business crises to prevent bankruptcy, but I've never made this public. I don't want Mr. and Mrs. Smiths to feel distant from me, or to humble themselves asking me to invest in the company. Thinking about this left me upset, so I called my fiancé John. After telling him everything, instead of comforting me, he sounded annoyed. "Sonny, put yourself in Clara's shoes. If you made a simple mistake and your fake golden child sister made a big fuss, would you be happy?" I was taken aback and asked, "What are you saying?" But John ignored my displeasure and continued, "Sonny, you need to recognize your own identity. Even though you're an heir, you're not their biological child. I'm telling you this for your own good." I was so angry I just hung up. Over the next month, I barely went out. I mostly talked to my investment assistant and ignored everyone else. That was until Becky told me John was waiting in the garden. I figured he was there to apologize. To me, our engagement was just our parents' idea, but he was always incredibly obliging. That's why I agreed to the engagement. But in the garden, John wasn't there, Clara was. She sized me up and said, "Sister, you haven't left the house for a month, but the moment you heard John came, you rushed here. I thought the daughter the Smiths doted on for over 20 years would be someone amazing, but you're just useless." Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, Clara had a tough time out there and suffered a lot. So I had no intention of doing anything to her. Having her around doesn't cost me anything. I rolled my eyes. "Clara, I never planned on fighting over anything with you. I'm not here for the Smiths' money, because I have my own." Clara laughed like she'd heard something hilarious. "Your money falling from the sky? Without Mom and Dad, you're nothing. Just a little trick from me, and they're on my side completely. What qualifications or leverage do you have to compete with me? I can't stand your fake demeanor. Now that I'm back, everything the Smiths have will be mine, the parents, the company, even your beloved fiancé. You should just crawl back into your garbage bin." Then out of nowhere, Clara suddenly hit herself and started crying. "Sister, I just came to see the flowers. I didn't mean to bother you." Her scream quickly brought Mr. and Mrs. Smiths running over, with John in tow. He looked at us, saying nothing. Mrs. Smiths called out for Clara and hugged her tightly. She then glared at me. "Sonny, why did you hit your sister?" I shook my head. "I didn't hit her." Mr. Smiths was furious. "If it wasn't you, was it me?" Before I could speak, Clara interrupted through sobs. "I just wanted to apologize to sister about the peanut porridge incident, but she was mad and wouldn't come out. When I heard John came, I made him leave so I could apologize properly. But soon after, sister just..." She wiped her tears. "But I don't blame sister. It was my fault with the peanuts. If sister hit me, I deserve it. So Mom and Dad, don't blame her." Mrs. Smiths, with tears in her eyes, looked at me. "Sonny, I know your father and I have been more focused on Clara lately. She suffered a lot. But trying to make amends, is that wrong?" I kept shaking my head, saying no, it's not wrong. But I didn't hit her. Clara stopped crying, came closer, and said softly, "Sister, let's not fight. Look how sad Mom and Dad are." Then she whispered in my ear, "There's no camera here. How will you explain?" I brushed her away and pointed at John. "I may not have surveillance proof, but I have a witness. John saw everything." My statement caught everyone off guard. Their eyes were all on John. Not looking at me, he lowered his eyes and said, "I was far away and couldn't hear, but Sonny did hit Clara." Clara chuckled softly next to me, whispering, "Sister, you didn't spend the last month doing nothing, did you? Surely, you didn't still think John was your fiancé?" Ignoring her, I focused on John. "Are you kidding me? Who's your fiancé?" He avoided my gaze, turning to Mr. and Mrs. Smiths and said sincerely, I came today about the engagement. The Whites and the Smiths' engagement isn't something I can proceed with an outsider, let alone someone so ruthless. I can't do it. I couldn't help but let out a cold laugh. So, you're here to switch out your fiancé this time? Clara frowned. Sister, it's all my fault. If you're not willing, I can leave the house now. Everything is my fault. I could go home if my sister allowed me. Mr. and Mrs. Smith exchanged a glance. Then Mr. Smith spoke. Clara, don't say that. This is your home. Nobody needs to give you permission. Plus, the engagement was originally meant to be between you and John. It's not switching, it's setting things right. Mrs. Smith nodded but was looking at me. Sonny, you've always said you refused to get married, which means your feelings for John were lukewarm at best. Now that Clara and John have developed real feelings, you shouldn't continue to take what rightfully belonged to Clara from the start. Mr. Smith hesitated. I've bought you a house on the west side of town. I know I said I'd treat you and Clara the same, but your recent actions have just angered me too much. Maybe once you've changed, we can. I sighed, cutting him off. All right, I get it. I'll move out now, as long as you all won't regret it. Saying that, I didn't look at the faces in front of me again. I turned and went back to the house. Just as I was about to pack my things, Clara followed me and yanked my hand. Are you feeling really smug? Even after all this, you just get sent to another house, with your cards still intact. I looked at Clara. What do you want then? Clara pointed at the surveillance camera above. Sis, you might not know, but I've turned off the cameras. I want you out of the Smiths for good. I can't live in fear that you'll make a comeback. I couldn't quite grasp what Clara meant. She smiled, then screamed and fell down the stairs. When Mr. and Mrs. Smith and John arrived, they only saw Clara lying at the bottom, while I stood in shock at the top. I honestly didn't expect Clara to play such a dangerous game. Mrs. Smith held Clara in her arms, relieved to see only minor injuries. Clara weakly said, I just wanted Sis to stay. I don't know why she'd do this to me. If she really hates me so much, I can leave. I protested. No, it wasn't me. She fell by herself trying to frame me. You have to believe me. I tried to explain calmly. Mr. Smith was nearly apoplectic with rage. He stormed over and slapped me hard several times. Sonny, you've thoroughly disappointed me. I thought you were changing, but now you've resorted to something like this. You get out of the Smiths. No, I'm disowning you. John called a lawyer to draw up papers to dissolve the adoption. The lawyer came quickly, and after Mr. and Mrs. Smith signed, they tossed the papers my way. Sign this, and you won't be part of the Smiths anymore. Whatever money you spent over the past 20+ years, I interrupted Mr. Smith. The money spent in the Smiths, I'll repay it all. Just name the amount. John stopped me from signing. Sonny, stop this. You were raised in luxury, and don't know what it's like to be poor. Just apologize to Clara, and you'll be welcomed back and won't become destitute. Clara nodded eagerly. Yes, sis, just apologize and you can stay. Mom and Dad will forgive you. Don't take advantage of their love to torment them. Then Clara turned to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mom, Dad, Sis isn't like me. She's never suffered. If you throw her out penniless, she'll starve. At least give her some money to survive, okay? Mr. and Mrs. Smith hesitated. After all, there were genuine feelings over the 20+ years, and they'd treated me well. Clara saw their hesitation and kneeled. Mom, Dad, let it be me that leaves. Keep Sis here. She's good-hearted. Once she takes over the Smiths, she'll surely give me a way out. Mr. and Mrs. Smith seemed to have made up their minds. Hurry up and sign. Once it's done, get out. From now on, you're nothing to us. Whether you starve or freeze, it's got nothing to do with us. Feeling disheartened, I signed the papers. After I signed, I picked up my phone to call my assistant. Henry, suspend that $30 billion investment we discussed for the Smiths. I'm not going through with it. Mr. and Mrs. Smith's faces changed drastically. What did you say? I was in no mood to explain. I took my copy of the agreement and turned to leave. Mrs. Smith grabbed my arm. What did you mean? How do you know about the $30 billion investment coming into the company? Clara, unaware of company affairs, thought I was bluffing. She chimed in quickly. Sis, you once told me you knew about not being related to Mom and Dad by blood. That you stayed in the Smiths for the power. I thought you were joking. Didn't know you were serious. I'm too lazy to explain. I never said anything like that. But John nodded thoughtfully. So, were you just pretending to be on the phone? Was it to scare Uncle and Aunt? Did you want them to ask you to stay? Mr. and Mrs. Smiths thought for a moment. It seemed like they also realized. There's no way a random call could affect a $30 billion investment. They were relieved. Sonny, since you were little, your mom and I taught you to be honest. How could you say something like this to scare us? Mrs. Smiths also stared at me. Tell me, who have you planted in the company? Before this, Clara said you were up to something. Said everything was about the Smiths' inheritance. I didn't believe it. But here you are. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Well, congratulations on figuring out who I really am. Let's not dwell on this. We need to get to the Civil Affairs Bureau and sign the papers. If you wait any longer, they'll close for the day. And you'll have to be my parents for one more day. So then Mr. and Mrs. Smiths followed me to the bureau. We brought Clara back home. That day the DNA test severed the ties between us. Once it was all over, I didn't look at them again. I got in my car to leave. But Clara stopped me. Since you said you don't want anything from the Smiths, shouldn't you give this car back to us too? Mr. and Mrs. Smiths glanced at my Rolls Royce, frowning. When did you buy this car? Is this where our money is going? I chuckled. Before I turned 18, my family was just average. My monthly allowance wasn't much. After I turned 18, they gradually became wealthier. They gave me $500,000 a month. I just gave you back all that allowance. Why do you think? This car was bought with your money. Besides, even if it was, I gave you back your money with interest. The car's mine, right? Clara seemed startled, remembering the card worth millions I gave Mr. and Mrs. Smiths. She quivered a bit, but stepped aside, enviously eyeing the car. Looks like you got a lot from them, huh? Giving away tens of millions just like that. Who knows if you bought or rented that car? But I'd warn you not to get too full of yourself. Once the money's gone, coming back to beg our parents won't be easy. Mr. and Mrs. Smiths nodded. Your sister's just looking out for you. Don't blow your money on appearances. Be wise with it. I really didn't have the patience to argue. I got in the car, planning to ask Henry about divestment. Just then, I saw Mr. Smiths pick up a call. I couldn't hear the other end, but his face got really serious. Divesting? How can that be? You know, if you pull out suddenly, the Smiths can't survive this year. We had it all worked out. We just needed to sign the contract. How can you back out now? The maid told me that it was chaos at the Smiths. My adoptive parents tried hard to reach out to me, but I didn't respond. They thought I was their lucky charm, and blamed the fake daughter. I realized they had known everything all along. I was even more certain not to invest. I returned to the estate I bought before. The maid left the Smiths after a few days, and came to find me. She looked at the estate, giving me a thumbs up. Miss, you're amazing. I thought I'd have to go back home after leaving the Smiths. Glad you remembered me. Seeing I was doing well, Becky couldn't stop saying, Miss, you wouldn't believe the mess after you left. The Mr. and Mrs. have been saying there's a big financial issue. Second Miss didn't realize how bad it was. Even went to ask young Master John for money, but he refused to see her. He even said he only wanted to marry her for the Smiths' wealth. Now the Smiths are like a clay idol crossing a river, useless to save themselves. So the engagement is off too. They've been trying to reach you for days, thinking you had something to do with the cancelled $30 billion investment. I just nodded non-committal and laughed. I told them they'd regret it. Becky thought for a moment and sighed. The Mr. and Mrs. went too far. Lately, they've been blaming the second Miss, saying she shouldn't have wrongly accused you. I thought they were bewitched by her. But all along, they knew she was lying. Of course they knew. They've been in business for years. And they've raised me from a kid. They know who I am. But I'm not their blood. So they chose not to believe me. After Clara came home, I was just extra baggage. Leaving the Smiths has its benefits. At least now I don't have to put my earnings into their black hole. I've saved them plenty of times. I guess I've repaid their kindness. Half a month after I pulled out, Mr. and Mrs. Smith's company struggled more and more. Even my repayment for raising me was just a drop in the bucket. Without new investments, they'd face bankruptcy. Desperate, they somehow tracked down my estate and showed up there. When they came, I was swimming, so I just threw on a robe and went to the sitting room to see the Smiths. As soon as I got there, Clara, always alert, spotted me right away. "What are you doing here?" I didn't reply to her. Instead, I asked her, "Why are you guys here?" Clara quickly figured out that we were here to see the owner of this place. She's an investor in our Smiths group. We're here to discuss investment, not to see you. So why are you here all hyped up? Just get out of here. I smiled a little but didn't leave. Instead, I sat directly at the main seat. The butler hurried over with a glass of orange juice for me. Clara was stunned for a moment when she saw this. Then she said, "The financial issues at home. Turns out it was you causing trouble behind our backs." Mr. and Mrs. Smith seemed surprised to see me there. "Sonny, what are you doing here?" Clara clicked her tongue. "Mom, Dad, how do you not get it? We kicked her out. And then she calls and makes the investor pull out their money, just to get back at us. Look at her. Dressed like that, flaunting in front of us. She must have something going on with the investor. That's why she can drive fancy cars. I always hear that a woman needs either a sugar daddy or a real dad. Your real dad died long ago. So seems like you went the sugar daddy route." I didn't argue, just looked at Mr. and Mrs. Smiths. "Is this why you came? Then you can leave now. I'm not interested in listening." Mr. Smith seemed to think it over for a bit, but quickly chose to believe Clara. His face changed dramatically. "How could you do something like this? I raised you better than that." Mrs. Smith seemed a bit hurt. "Sonny, can we leave it behind? I hate to see you suffer. Come back with me." Clara quickly stopped Mrs. Smith. "Mom, how do you still not get it? The investment was fine until she got us kicked out. She's been whispering to the investor. She's doing this on purpose. Sonny, even if you're not our biological daughter, we never treated you any less. If you hadn't caused trouble, we wouldn't have kicked you out. It's your own doing, you should just stay away." But before Clara could finish, Mrs. Smith interrupted with a slap. "You shut up. How can you talk to your sister like that?" Both Mr. Smith and Clara were shocked by Mrs. Smith's action. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, how could you hit me for this? This woman." Mrs. Smith ignored Clara and took my hand. "Sonny, I always knew you had potential. You're beautiful and smart. Now that you're close to our investor, please say something nice for us. Don't let our family go bankrupt. You know the company is your father and my heart and soul." Mr. Smith caught on too. Though still looking quite upset, his tone softened. "Yes, Sonny, if you can help us through this tough time, we're still your parents. If you don't like Clara, I'll have her apologize to you." Clara heard this and quickly held back her pride, covering her face as she looked at Mr. and Mrs. Smith. "Mom, Dad, I'm the real daughter of the Smiths. Now that the Whites won't have us, I'm willing to sacrifice for the family too. I refuse to believe Sonny is better than me." I squinted at Clara. "So you want to take my place?" Clara nodded. "Yes, for the family I'll do anything." Just then my assistant Henry walked in. Mr. and Mrs. Smiths didn't care much anymore, and quickly grabbed Henry's hand. "You're finally here. We're from the Smiths group. We'd like to discuss the investment matter further. It's about our survival." Clara quickly moved closer, fluttering her lashes at Henry. Henry got goosebumps and practically scrambled to hide behind me. Clara gritted her teeth. "Boss, my sister is lying to you. She's not a real Smith. Don't trust her and don't pull out the investment because of her." Henry was sweating. "I don't have the final say. You'll have to talk to my boss." Mr. and Mrs. Smith asked in unison, "Where's the boss?" Henry pointed at me. "Miss Sonny is the boss. Didn't you know?" His words were like a bombshell. Clara literally fell off her chair. Mr. and Mrs. Smiths looked stunned, but somehow maintained their balance. It was Clara who shakily pointed at me. "How can this be? You can't be the investor. You can't have billions. This must be fake. You're just a fake heiress, just a pretender." Henry seemed confused. "I thought you already knew. Since she was 18, Miss Sonny has invested many times in the company, each time during critical moments. How could you not know? Who else but Miss Sonny would pour money into you guys time after time, only to lose it every single time? Over the years, Miss Sonny has lost quite a bit on the Smiths group. Mr. and Mrs. Smith seemed to finally grasp the situation. They looked at me in shock. It really is you. But why didn't you tell us? If you had, we wouldn't have kicked you out. I found it amusing and couldn't help but speak up. Yeah. If I had told you earlier, you would have kept asking me to bail out the Smiths. And when Clara accused me falsely, you'd have stood by me, right? Mr. and Mrs. Smith looked even more awkward. That's not what we meant. We know Clara bullied you, we feel bad about it. That's why we brought Clara to apologize. Yeah, Clara, come on, get on your knees and apologize to your sister. Clara was holding on to the chair, refusing to get up. Why should I? She demanded. Just because she's rich? Being rich doesn't give her the right to bully me. Mom, Dad, have you forgotten? I'm your real daughter. How can you force me to apologize for the sake of money and this woman? I chuckled to myself. Now you remember they're your parents? Have you forgotten about what you did with the peanuts? I specifically told you your mom was allergic, yet you still did it. And now you have the nerve to talk about being the real daughter. Clara felt she did nothing wrong. She deserved it, Clara said. Why would I call her mom? I was home for half a month, talking bad about you, but she never believed me. She always said I was causing trouble. I had to do something for her to believe me. Mrs. Smith clutched her chest. Clara, I've always treated you better. Mr. Smith slapped Clara hard. This is how you treat me and your mom? Do you have any conscience? Without us, you wouldn't be here. Clara held her face, glaring at Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now that Sonny's rich, you act like this? I only regret not giving you more peanuts. You should have kicked Sonny out the day I came back. With me being your real daughter, you don't need this fake one. If you had kicked her out initially, none of this would have happened. Your company's downfall isn't my fault either. That's your problem, don't blame me. I'm not apologizing or taking responsibility. With that, Clara left my estate without hesitation, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Smith stunned. I waved Henry over with a contract. I'm giving you two options. First, leave the Smiths group. I'll take over and ensure you have retirement funds. Second, leave now, and your future is none of my business. After some hesitation, they chose the first option. Once they signed, I had Becky see them out. Henry, observing, said, Miss Sunny, you're still too soft-hearted. I shook my head. Not at all. I've invested too much in the Smiths. I don't want to give it up. Besides, I'm confident I can turn it around. I'm a businesswoman. I won't let emotions interfere with making money. Henry grinned and gave me a thumbs up, staying silent. Taking over the Smiths group caused quite a stir in the industry. The most shocked was John. He came with a big bouquet of roses. Sonny, he said confidently, let's start over. Let's leave the past behind. I just rolled my eyes. In my mind, you're already as good as dead. The dead shouldn't appear before the living. John thought I was joking. He chuckled awkwardly. Seeing I wasn't, he nervously continued, Sonny, but... I cut him off. You can stay here annoying me. I don't mind if another group goes under. Only then did John leave, fearing the consequences. Without their company, Mr. and Mrs. Smith left the mansion, back to middle-class life. It was like returning to square one after years of work. Clara, after leaving my house, never came back. Rumor has it she stole a lot of Mr. and Mrs. Smith's savings and disappeared. They didn't report her to the police, and claimed they no longer had a daughter. Years passed, and I became the richest person in the state. I saw Clara again with a man twice her age. Her heavy makeup said her life wasn't great, but it's not my concern anymore. Family and love can betray you, but money you earn won't. My parents tried to hurt me over weak familial ties, but their own daughter betrayed them in the end. Love yourself first before loving anyone else. The end.